What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk. And in this episode, I'm going to be breaking down the 2023 season, providing a full season in review. And I'm going to have a couple of guests making an appearance at the end of this video. Two of my friends, college football fans, whose teams had really incredible seasons. One of them ended up on top of the college football world. Another one won the Goodyear Cotton Bowl Classic over the Ohio State Buckeyes. And interestingly enough, both of these guys, who I would consider friends of mine, beat Ohio State this year. Their teams beat Ohio State this year. So just kind of an interesting dynamic there. But we'll hear from them at the end of this video or near the end of this video. But if you go on to enjoy, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever we post. But without further ado, let's dive into the 2023 season in review. I'm going to get started with kind of going through some of the key things that happened this season. And you can't start a recap of the 2023 season without talking about the Colorado and Coach Prime hype train. Really well before the season even started. I mean, I made a video in January of last year. I think it probably went up around when this video is going to be going up, around the midpoint of January last year, going over Coach Prime getting hired for the position for the Buffalo's head coach, the players he'd be bringing in, the transfers, all that sort of thing. And that video actually kind of did really well on this channel and kind of jump-started everything. But all the hype that was built up, his son Shedeur Sanders at quarterback, Shiloh Sanders on defense, and obviously the two-way player Travis Hunter created a lot of buzz around the Buffaloes. And I mean, I think it was helped by the fact that in their first game of the season, they played against the team that was the defending runner-up, TCU Horned Frogs. Obviously, that team lost a lot, including quarterback Max Duggan and Quentin Johnston. But overall, it was a matchup that created a lot of buzz. I mean, it was big noon kickoff, Gus Johnson and Joel Klatt on the call. And Colorado won a very exciting game. I mean, the offenses went up and down the field. I think it was an early sign of the defensive struggles and the offensive line struggles that Colorado would go on to have throughout the year. And so they create some hype. The next week, then they play against Nebraska at home, their first home game in the Prime era. You know, bringing back kind of a rivalry game, a big rivalry that was huge in the 90s, especially when both teams were really good. But that was more of a defensive battle. They kind of, both offenses struggled in that game, or you could say the defenses played well. But after that, they get what was, I think, really the warning sign ultimately of what would happen in an exciting but poor overtime win over Colorado State. They're in-state rivals, if you can call them that. And so after that, though, they go on to get stomped. They get into the rankings. I think they crack the top 20, and they get stomped by Oregon. And then I think a week or a couple weeks later, they're up by 29 against Stanford, and they end up collapsing. It was an incredible game by Stanford, especially their wide receiver in that game. But ultimately, they fell apart down the stretch run. Again, the issues with the offensive line, they are certainly hoping to bolster that here in the offseason, and with both any transfers coming in, and especially seems like more so in recruiting now. It'll be interesting to see if they're able to hold on to I think 4 or 5 stars that they are hoping to get on the offensive line. But they end up losing their last 6 games. They finished the season 4-8, which I think was a reasonable expectation before the season. I think especially that first win, and even starting 3-0, kind of had some people, really going all gas, no brakes. But Colorado, it was a step forward. You win 1 game the year before and you go up to 4, so it's an improvement. But that was certainly one of the storylines of the season. And then some of the moments, I won't spend as much time on these because I spent a lot of time talking about Colorado there. Texas, with an incredible season for the Longhorns, Steve Sarkisian, who will be staying there, led Texas as they kind of took apart the Crimson Tide in Tuscaloosa, especially offensively. They did a good job defensively as well, limiting the Crimson Tide. Quinn Ewers, Xavier Worthy, A.D. Mitchell, and the Texas offense was able to put up some big numbers against the Crimson Tide. And then I think the next week or a couple weeks later was kind of the reverse, a top 10 showdown in South Bend that ended up, it looked like it might have some implications, but ended up not really being as major of a deal, especially for the Irish. But Ohio State gets a classic, I mean, I know Notre Dame's not Big Ten, but a Big Ten football defensive slugfest, 17-14, scoring a touchdown as time expires in that game. It was kind of a throwback game to, years and days gone by in college football. And some games that we've seen like that, you look at 2011 LSU against Alabama, a 9-6 game, but it's not something you see too often in college football anymore, especially at the top. You might see it in Big Ten West games where the offenses just don't exist. But other than that, it's not something you see a whole lot of. So then a couple of other things. I mean, you have the massive showdown in Seattle, Oregon at Washington. The Huskies hold on, and it was a moment for the Pac-12 too. And talked about Colorado already, but the Pac-12, that was a storyline in the season. And to me, I'm gonna get into this more later, but I think I'll actually kind of share my perspective on it. I have three things at the end of this video that I'm gonna be going over: the biggest disappointment, the best or biggest surprise, and then the best story. And to me, I think the best story of this college football season was the Pac-12. I think you start things out with knowing that the conference is no longer going to exist. So the whole season is almost like a farewell tour of sorts for the conference that is very entertaining. Have they always had the best success at the very top of college football? No. But I think it was a special season, and ultimately, a storybook ending would have been Washington winning the national championship over Michigan. But to have it kind of start with like the main storyline being Colorado and have it end with Washington in the national championship and their head coach taking the best coaching job in college football, Kalen DeBoer going to Alabama, I think is about as good of a story as you can have in college football. And I mean, it was an opportunity for the competitive, highly competitive, super just entertaining Pac-12 to be on full display with this Washington-Oregon game. I mean, it was a offensive showcase. It was a battle throughout. Bo Nix against Michael Penix Jr., the three-headed beast at receiver for the Huskies. It was just such a fun game to watch. It came down to a potential game-tying field goal that went, I think, left. It was missed either way, and the fans stormed the field at Husky Stadium and created one of the images of the season. So throughout this season, I mean, you look at a team like in Arizona too, who took strides this year. I talked about them in a video that had, the Wildcats, them and Northwestern both taking strides this year. I think Northwestern's also a story that was a major storyline of this year after what happened in the offseason for them. But the Pac-12, I mean, Oregon State having a good year. And then you have some disappointments like USC. I'll get in more into the Trojans later, but it was a storybook season, storybook ending for the Pac-12, and it'll be interesting to see what, there's not really anything that like concrete. Oregon State and Washington State are probably, I think they're going to be keeping their rivalry games going against Oregon and Washington. Probably be playing a lot of Mountain West teams. It'll be interesting to see. I'll pop up their 2024 schedules on here because I imagine those are announced and finalized. If not, scratch that and that won't be included. But yeah, it was. I think that was my story of the year. I'll the two guys that I'm having on later in the video we'll talk about their stories of the year. But it was a great season for the Pac-12 to kind of be on display. A couple other big moments in the season. Missouri was an upstart team, and I imagine we'll hear more about the Tigers from one of the guys who will be talking. But if not too much, the Tigers had an incredible season. Elijah Drinkwitz led them to an 11-2 year, Cotton Bowl champions with the win over Ohio State. But ultimately, Georgia ended what could have been a college football playoff charge with a 30-21 win, kind of in mid-October. Same week in the Bedlam finale, which was another storyline. This realignment has some rivalries, some that are continuing and some that are kind of saying goodbye. Oklahoma State ended Oklahoma's chances for the college football playoff. The Sooners the week before had lost to Kansas. That wasn't a death blow, though, because they had the win in a classic Cotton Bowl over Texas. Texas lone loss of the season, but that one kind of stamped that Oklahoma wouldn't have a chance. But still, I think when it comes to teams that were a surprise this year, I think Oklahoma going from 6 wins up to 10 was a big team that made strides this year. And then you have Penn State. And my friend Joe talks more about Penn State, so I'll save it for that part of the video. But I think their offense was just absolutely probably one of the biggest disappointments in college football this year. Their defense shown throughout the year, even in those games against Ohio State and Michigan, they did a fair job on defense. but it's a team that continues to not be able to win those two games, the two biggest games of its season. Next year, they if they can win every other game, they're probably going to be okay. They'll probably make the playoff at 10-2. They were inside the top 12 at the end of this season, kind of like an Ole Miss. Ole Miss is kind of the same way. They had a showdown win, classic offenses all over the field against LSU as well. That was a big game this year. That was at least entertaining. Didn't have a lot of CFP implications, but it was a fun game to watch. And so, you look at teams like that are kind of on the fringe that just can't quite catch up. For Ole Miss, can't catch up to an Alabama. They don't really play Georgia, but haven't caught up to them either. And Penn State just can't catch up in those games. You talk about Ryan Day struggling in big games. And again, I'm going to save this because Joe talks about it more later, but James Franklin really just cannot win those games. So I think their storyline was having a quarterback like Drew Aller who just struggled all season, and especially in those big games, and was very, very ballyhooed, very hyped up, but just couldn't deliver this year. So then kind of running down the finales of the season, you have Michigan defeating Ohio State in what was probably the best iteration of the game since 2016. Came down to the final drive. Ohio State had been able to pull back from being down 2 scores. Were down by just 6. They were driving. Had a couple of big plays there at the end, but then Jalen Harrell gets a hit. Rod Moore gets the game-sealing interception, and the Wolverines get another win, their 3rd straight over Ohio State. And then conference championship week rolls around, and Nick Saban, unbeknownst at the time, I guess, maybe even to him, because he said up until he announced his retirement, he was still wrestling with it, but he goes out as SEC champion. He gets a win over Georgia, and to get there, the week before, they had to, the gravedigger play against Auburn. Isaiah Bond, who is now in the transfer portal, keeping an eye on that, makes a phenomenal catch. Jalen Milroe with the throw to the back corner of the end zone on 4th and 31 after a couple penalties had set a bad snap and a couple of penalties put Alabama back. So, a big win there, and then Saban comes out on top over Kirby Smart and the Georgia Bulldogs in the SEC championship game. So Saban finishes perfect 9-0 in the SEC and puts Alabama in the playoff once again. So then you go with another story, I guess, here is the disappointment for Florida State. And Florida State, in no way did they disappoint this season. Did they play perfect all season? Did they play perfect football? Maybe not, but they did have a perfect record by the time the regular season and conference championships ended. So I think that was a story as well. And then obviously the injury kind of in a real throwaway game against North Alabama. I mean, you absolutely never want to see an injury to a star player, but the Jordan Travis injury is definitely a sad one, and I hope he can get back to being full ability and is able to get drafted by an NFL team and have a good chance there to make some noise in the NFL. But that was another big thing. Florida State, they go 13-0, the first undefeated Power 5 team to be left out of the college football playoff. And then, I talked about this in kind of I think a bowl recap or one of the other videos I made recently about how Georgia showed up for that Peach Bowl and Florida State, or not the Peach Bowl, the Orange Bowl, and Florida State simply did not. So they don't end the season perfect, but up until when they really were at full strength, they were a solid team this year. I think tough to play in a weak ACC, but overall very good season for the Seminoles. And with Mike Norvell staying around, it'll be interesting to see what they do next year. They're losing a lot, but talk more about that as we go into the 2024 outlook in future videos. But then we get to the college football playoff semifinals. Obviously, plenty of entertaining bowl games in the lead up to there. Look at the Pop-Tarts Bowl, and then I think it was the Cheez-Its Bowl, Clemson against Kentucky. Really, really good game there. Touchdowns going back and forth late in that game. But we get to the semifinals, and they were instant classics. You have Michigan getting a stop. Their defense, which was the best in college football all year, gets a stop at the goal line to seal that Rose Bowl win over Alabama in overtime. And then Washington, Texas is, as expected, offense is going up and down the field. I think it was a total of 68 points, 37-31. Texas has a chance late after an injury to Dylan Johnson stopped the clock, and they ultimately couldn't quite get into the end zone, though, on a great play by Elijah Jackson to swat the ball away. So we're set up with a future All-Big Ten national championship, and Michigan is able to finish the job and I also asked my brother, who's a college football fan as well, what his disappointments and surprises were. He said his disappointment, he said, was Ohio State, which I can understand. You play all season for the game to set the stage for a postseason run, and they lose that, so that's certainly a disappointment. And the final record shows as 11-2. I'm not saying there's an asterisk at all, and they definitely could have, even with the opt-outs, showed up for the Cotton Bowl, but they simply were not there, and they still lost the game on the field. So they're certainly a candidate for disappointment of the year. I think the biggest surprise that he said was was Michigan, and Michigan winning the national championship was the best story. He said regretfully, because we're obviously born and raised as Buckeye fans. So those were his thoughts on that. And so, and then I guess one final thing, Michigan, again, finishes the job as national champions, and the Heisman Trophy winner, Jaden Daniels, phenomenal season for LSU, both passing and running the ball for the Tigers, who had a solid year. It was certainly, I think they were one of the teams that were a disappointment, but let's get into the submissions from my friends Henry and Joe and come back and kind of finish it up after going through their thoughts.
What's up, College Football Talk? This is Joseph, Peter's basically brother, best friend, co-host of True North Talk. And for the video today, he asked me to submit a few answers. So these are my answers to the question. So the biggest disappointment this year, I'm going to go with Penn State. And for many reasons. I don't think James Franklin ever gets as much criticism as I think he deserves. It's quite perplexing to me if you look at his record against Michigan, Ohio State, basically every big game he's played in besides the 2016 Ohio State game, he's been a constant disappointment. He cannot win the big games. Michigan this year was literally handed to him on a silver platter. So much noise around the program. Harbaugh gets suspended the day before the game when they get off the plane. Acting head coach Sherrone Moore absolutely outcoached Franklin 10-1. I mean, probably even worse than that. So biggest disappointment, Penn State. Big surprise, I'm going to go Ohio State. I actually thought, and I know I picked Michigan to win the game, but I thought Ohio State would have a really good chance at winning this year at Michigan. And just all the talent on that team, I don't think it was a huge failure this season. I mean, 11-1 with a loss against Missouri, which, I mean, third strings are in. I don't think you can really put a whole lot of stock into that. But, it still was a surprise to me that that team didn't make a more serious run at the title. Ryan Day, a little bit of a disappointment to me. It'll be interesting to see what happens next year, though, with Will Howard coming in with the Ole Miss running back, with some of the transfers. Burke's coming back. A lot of guys are coming back, so we'll see what happens next year. Best story, Peter told me I couldn't do Michigan winning at all. I don't want to, beat that dead horse, so that we've all heard enough about Michigan at this point. But I will say, a smaller aspect than just the overall story of Michigan winning at all, I'm going to go Blake Corum. And it's because Corum had a season-ending knee injury last year against before Ohio State against Illinois. A lot of people doubted that he'd come back and be full go, and you could even argue that he's been stronger this year since that injury, which is really cool to see after a serious knee injury. He didn't have as many electric, long, 60, 70-yard touchdown runs, 50 yards, but he had more touchdowns. He's hit the touchdown record. He pretty much carried Michigan on his back all season long. He had the winning touchdown against Penn State on the road, the clinching touchdown against Ohio State late in the third quarter, and the clinching touchdown against both Alabama and Washington for the national championship. So I don't think there's a better story in college football than Blake Corum coming back, avenging his knee injury, righting the wrongs of last year's season, and carrying his team to a national championship. So that's my 3 picks. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and tune in to the rest of the video. See you.
Hey there, everyone. Hope you're having a good weekend and watching some NFL playoff football. My name is henryrau. Today I'm going to go over 3 categories with you. Biggest disappointment, biggest surprise, and best story of the college football season. Biggest disappointment for me was USC. They were preseason ranked top 10 at number 6. They had Heisman candidate Caleb Williams, a lot of weapons on offense, and head coach Lincoln Riley. And they fell short this year at 8-5. I think they just did not meet expectations. Biggest surprise this year is going to be Northwestern. They finished 1-11 last year, and they were preseason ranked to be the bottom of the division. They actually went above 500 in Big Ten play, and wins against Wisconsin, Minnesota, Purdue, which is solid programs. So a good year for Northwestern. Best story for me is going to be Washington. I know they have Michael Penix and all these weapons on offense, but to say that they were going to be in the championship game, I think really surprised me. They really stepped it up this year. So that's what I have for you.
Thank you, Henry and Joe, for your thoughts on the college football season. I certainly agree. Blake Corum's comeback, Joe, was one of the best stories of the year. And, shout out to your Missouri Tigers, Henry. They had a phenomenal year. But before I wrap up this video, I want to go over my thoughts on I talked about the best story of the year already, the Pac-12 being that, just their final season and the just success that they had reaching the national championship game again. Biggest surprise, I think probably, I don't think it would be Michigan. Before the season, I said Michigan and Washington were probably the teams with the best chance to beat Georgia, to get to the top of college football world. So I would say probably Missouri, and perhaps second to them being Arizona and Northwestern. Probably, I think Northwestern especially, just because of the fact that they were coming off a 1-win season. Then they lose Pat Fitzgerald, their head coach, who had been there for, almost, 17 years or something like that. I think he was there from 2006 through 2022. But David Braun comes in as the interim head coach and helps the Wildcats to 8 wins. And same with Jedd Fisch out in Arizona. They've had a little bit more of a steady progression up to 10 wins this year, but a huge jump for them. But I think the big question is, and to me, there's kind of an obvious answer, who was the biggest disappointment of the college football season? And I think that is the USC Southern California Trojans. You have the reigning Heisman Trophy winner, and Caleb Williams had a good year. He had a very good year. It was kind of prep work for the NFL draft. And what really bit the Trojans again, and I guess, before the season, probably could have seen it coming a little bit, but it was their defense, not just poor at times, but at times one of the worst in the Pac-12. And they, end up doing even worse than they did last year. At least last year they reached the Pac-12 championship game. I think they finished 10-4. This year they finished 8-5. They have a good outlook for the future. Miller Moss did a great job in the Holiday Bowl, but USC I think was certainly the biggest disappointment this year because, again, you have the Heisman Trophy winner. You have expectations that maybe this offense can overcome those issues on the defensive end. And you look at a team like a Washington, and I think LSU, this is where they're kind of in the middle ground. They disappointed somewhat, but I don't think the expectations were quite as high as at USC, but they were pretty much on par. So I would say it's kind of a 2-horse race for biggest disappointment between USC and LSU. Both of those teams, we'll see what their future looks like. Both, I imagine, are losing quarterbacks. I think Jaden Daniels is going to the NFL draft. So it'll be interesting to see what both of those teams can do next year. Obviously, USC will be coming over to the Big Ten. I think they, will find it more difficult to have the high-powered offense that they've had in previous years, or it's possible maybe that it's overwhelming. But what I was starting to say too, though, is Washington had the best offense in college football, and that was enough to overcome maybe some of the deficiencies that they had on the defensive end. I think the Huskies were a better unit collectively on defense, but the Trojans definitely could have done a lot better than they did this year. But that is it for the 2023 college football season. I know this video has probably dragged on for a little bit, but if you stuck around, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Thank you if you're one of the subscribers or regular viewers for taking the time to watch College Football Talk this season. And I won't be away for long. We'll be coming back here shortly with maybe an early look at some 2024 storylines, some transfer news, and just an overall outlook for what this offseason is going to look like. But again, thank you so much for watching College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burtnett, signing out. Peace.